Hello, freaks, geeks, basement dwellers, vatniks, and all you beautiful scrufftards. Welcome to the War Zone. I'm Scruffy, and this is Scruffy Tales. And I figured I would go balls deep Armchair General and speculate and try and figure out why exactly Kursk actually, in the end, might allow Ukraine to win the war. Because it's a very common question in the comment sections, isn't it? Why is Ukraine invading Kursk? They need the troops elsewhere. Well, let's take a look why Ukraine might actually be invading or fighting up in Kursk. So what is the ultimate goal of Ukraine? Well, it is to liberate lost territory that has been stolen by Russia in this unjustified war, this invasion where Russia is merely destroying Ukraine, killing Ukrainian civilians, and stealing Ukrainian children. So Ukraine, they can't surrender because that is, a catastrophe beyond anything that they have already suffered. So the overall goal is to liberate lost territory, including Crimea. And how do you do this? Well, there are a lot of Russians in the way to achieve this. So that is why Ukraine are trying to move the war away from Ukraine and into Russia. And how are they doing this? Well, an opportunity presented itself when Russia began preparations to start a front line at Kharkiv. They amassed 30,000 troops in Belgorod and 20,000 troops in Kursk to launch two offensives into Kharkiv and into Sumy Oblast. They launched the Kharkiv front offensive. That ended up slowing down rather quickly, so they moved the 20,000 they had in Sumy, or in Kursk I should say, down to Belgorod to support the fighting in Kharkiv. Ukraine had already been building up troops to defend Sumy against those 20,000. So now they had a bunch of troops in Sumy Oblast ready to do what? Well, Kursk was more or less undefended. So Ukraine started shipping troops up to Sumy, and then they launched the Kursk incursion. And now we have a situation that is quite interesting. Ukraine has, by doing this, locked a whole lot of Russian units, including all the resources needed to support them, locked them down in place in Russia, instead of having all of these assets down in Ukraine. Ukraine has effectively moved a huge chunk of the war away from Ukraine and into Russia itself. Right? So, yes, the Kharkiv front line, Russia is on the offensive there technically, but I mean what the end result is that Ukraine is tying up vast amounts of Russian resources in Russia. Right? Moving assets and resources away from the battles in Ukraine, they are now locked in place in Russia. The same thing up in Kursk. That is why they pushed into Kursk. They could never hold Kursk. Right? You can't invade Russia and expect them to let that slide. Eventually, Russia will move as much troops as they need in order to push you out. And Ukraine knew this. But what has happened here is Ukraine has now moved a huge chunk of the war to Belgorod and Kursk along this narrow sliver of the border. Instead of having massive swaths of Ukraine being occupied and reduced to rubble, we now have, in this area at least, a thin sliver of along the border where things are happening, where things are being destroyed. And Ukraine is able to dish out punishment into Russia itself with aircraft, with drones, with artillery. Right? So Ukraine is destroying targets in Russia and not just defending themselves within Ukraine. So you have moved the war into Russia itself. And Ukraine needs to continue to do this to further weaken Russian assets along the front line here in Ukraine. Because if you weaken the front line down here, obviously this increases your chances of pushing back and liberating territory, right? So, I mean, it's interesting. You have some Ukrainian shenanigans here with Black Hawks, Ukrainian strikes further in to Russia here as well. This was just a week or two ago that this happened. So maybe they're doing some reconnaissance over Russian border, what do you call it, defenses and stuff like that. Maybe we will see another Ukrainian push here. So we see more Russian assets moved up to Belgorod and Kursk to defend this border, meaning you have fewer Russians down here, fewer assets. And Russia now basically need to, do we support supply depots in Voronezh, or do we support supply depots in Rostov-on-Don? How do we allocate assets, right? Meanwhile, for Ukraine, I mean, if we assume that Poltava is the main hub, the main command post for the Ukrainians, I mean, if they use this to portion out resources, I mean, they can. It's basically the same distance all over the place, all over, right? They still just need to focus resources here in Poltava, and then you move it out as needed. Troops, fuel, ammunition, medical supplies, food, and everything, right? Meanwhile, Russia has to stretch their logistics. Yes, they're still in Russia, but I mean, you still need multiple supply hubs to support this long, extensive front line all the way down to the coastline, right? That means you have to make decisions. You have to think about where you need to send stuff, where are they the most needed. The Ukrainians, they just need to have a few central supply hubs, and they can supply the entire front line quite easily, right? A situation arises in Kharkiv, well, send them some troops then, or move them up from Kupiansk. It's not that easy for the Russians, because if you have resources in Voronezh that are needed down around Crimea, for instance, for whatever reason, that's a long way to transport those resources to have an effect on the front line. Ukraine is not in that position. Ukraine can quite easily, technically speaking, support the front in Kursk as well as the front in Zaporizhia. Technically, I mean, it all depends on how much they have of their resources, but you get my point. So, Kursk and Belgorod, this is where Ukraine can win the war, essentially, or weaken the Russians enough to begin liberating territory. If they can lock down all of these units, all of the assets needed to support them, that means Russia is weaker up here. The more damage they inflict up here, the more Russians will be moved up here. We know that Ukraine has already forced Russia to, for the first 6 months in Kursk, Russia moved in total 100,000 troops, out of which around 40,000 were casualties in those first months. I mean, we know Russia allocated 50,000 troops to Kharkiv initially, and I mean, they moved in more troops over time here as well. So this front line here is demanding massive resources from the Russians that Ukraine is now locking in place, weakening the front line within within Ukraine. And this has the potential possibility down the line of allowing Ukraine to begin liberating territory if this front line grows weak enough, and if they can build up a capable force that can push through and assault occupied territory. Pokrovsk, equally important in this aspect. Why hasn't Russia pushed into Pokrovsk or Mirnorod? Well, two big cities, very heavily defended. If they push in prematurely, Russia will more than likely lose the war in these two cities. That is why they're trying to come up here to the west to cut supply lines leading into these cities. That is why they're pushing up here as well to the east. That's the same thing, cutting all the supplies coming in from the north and from the west, and to an extent from the east. Because as long as Ukraine can support, supply Pokrovsk and Myrnorod, Ukraine has the advantage in the cities, and that means that they can actually break the Russian army in Pokrovsk. Remember, in Bakhmut, Russian sources, credible sources, have told us that Russia lost 80,000 troops in Bakhmut. Right? We know that Russia lost some 40,000 casualties in Avdiivka over here. Just imagine the casualty figures for Russia if they push in prematurely into Pokrovsk and Myrnorod. It will be a disaster on such magnitude that Russia could actually lose the war. And that is why they haven't pushed in yet. That is why they're still on the outskirts, still trying to come up to the west and cut supply lines. Also why they're pushing out in this area here. This is to allow them to spread out artillery all over the place here to support an eventual assault, to be able to hammer logistics and rearward positions for the Ukrainians. So if Ukraine can hold on to Pokrovsk and grind down the Russians here in Myrnorod and Pokrovsk, combined with tying up massive amounts of Russian resources and assets up here, then you begin to see how Ukraine down the line could actually turn this around. The next problem is, of course, where will Ukraine assault? We know that the Russians have built a massive, very respected I couldn't find a word there. A defensive line that you must respect here, all the way from Zaporizhia, essentially all the way up to the border up here north of Kupiansk. And the minefield, it's essentially one massive minefield, and Ukraine will have difficulty pushing through it. Now, what do you do with a defensive line like this? Well, you have two choices. You either move through it or go around it. Ukraine tried to move through it. We saw what that led to in 2023. During the Winter War, Russia, the Soviet Union, tried to push through the Finnish defensive line known as the Mannerheim Line, and we all know how that ended up. Russia suffered tremendous casualties trying to push through the Finnish defensive lines. So how do you do it? Well, you try and move around it. It is what the Germans did to the Maginot Line, the French defensive line along the French border with Germany. The Germans realized it's too much of an obstacle. If we try it, we will be destroyed. So what did they do? They moved around it. When the Americans and their allies intended to invade Iraq, the Iraqis had built an impressive defensive line in the south of Kuwait facing Saudi Arabia. What did the allies do together with the Americans? The Americans and some French units moved around that impressive Iraqi defensive line and came up behind it. And that is how you began to push the Iraqis back. So how can Ukraine move around this impressive defensive line that the Russians have built along the here in the occupied territories, from the border up in Kupiansk all the way down to Zaporizhia? Well, Ukraine only has one option, and no, it's not going through Belgorod and coming in north of Kupiansk. That is not the option. The option is Kherson, an amphibious landing, securing ports, and then with larger cargo ships pushing as quickly as possible troops and material into those ports and securing a beachhead, and then pushing on out from that position, much like we saw the Allies do at Normandy and the invasion of France. That is how you can bypass this heavily defended fortified line here that the Russians have built. And how do you do that? Well, it just so happens that Ukraine has 38 of the world's best assault craft designed for operations like this, the Combat Boat 90. Each Combat Boat 90 can hold 18 Marines. So if you have 38 of them, as you can imagine, you can quickly assault a specific landing zone and secure it and hold it until you are relieved. These 38 boats can move back and forth at high speed, bring in another batch of Marines, and then you secure a port where you can bring in larger cargo ships that begins to deploy or unload troops, materiel, weapons, and vehicles. So that is what I'm thinking is Ukraine's hope here. Tying up as much of the Russian army as possible in Kursk and Belgorod, which they are doing a fantastic job of at the moment. And crucially, holding Pokrovsk and Myrnorod once Russia begins to push into these cities. Do these two things. Hold up here in the north and hold Pokrovsk, and they actually stand a chance of whittling down the Russian army to such an extent that you can launch an amphibious assault in the Kherson area to bypass the impressive defensive lines that we see here between Kupiansk and Zaporizhia. I mean, just looking here at the deep state map, you can see here the white here are the Russian defensive lines, and I mean, quite obviously, it's a tall order trying to push through any of this, since we know how thick, deep, and wide the minefields are, and Russia has covering fields of fire from anti-tank missiles and what have you. It's a tall order trying to push through this. We know this now. We know the extent of the minefield. So where does that leave us? Well, it leaves us with trying to come through here somewhere, right? Because this is where the defensive lines are, well, technically weaker, but you also have the river, right? That is helping out with the defenses. Has to be said. But still, if you do get troops across the river, this is where you can actually stand some chance of fighting through, coming in behind, and start maneuvers behind the defensive lines. It's a lot tougher trying to push through all this thick here. The same thing here. Trying to continue push Russia back from Pokrovsk to reach Donetsk and stuff like this. Now I'm thinking it is down here where Ukraine stands a chance of turning things around and start liberating their own territory, right? They need to push into Belgorod, into Kursk. They need to apply pressure at Kharkiv to tie up as many Russian assets as possible. Russia needs to move troops up here away from the war within Ukraine and tie down all the Russian assets, weakening the main front line, and then eventually, maybe next year, maybe this year even, launch an assault and gain some foothold at Kherson and the Dnieper River. So I'm thinking Kursk and Belgorod, this is where Ukraine can actually grind the Russians down, move the Russians away from the war within Ukraine. Hopefully Ukraine can cause some major damage to the Russian war machine here at Pokrovsk, and all things combined will allow Ukraine to begin liberating territory in and around Kherson. So that might be might be happening if we take a look at the big picture long term. But here and now, Kursk is still important because it allows Ukraine to go on the offensive. It allows them to keep the Russians guessing, right? Here Ukraine actually has some initiative. They can actually initiate battles. They can go in on the offensive. They can take territory from the Russians. They can force Russia to allocate vast amount of resources into an area where Russia doesn't want to fight. If Ukraine is not at Kursk, then every battle takes place where Russia wants to fight. then every maneuver takes place where Russia wants to maneuver, right? Then every territory that switches hands within Ukraine, where Russia is trying to take territory. By going on the offensive in and around Kursk, Ukraine can decide where to initiate battle, can force Russia to fight battles Russia doesn't want to fight, to force Russia to move troops and assets into an area where Russia doesn't want to have these assets, right? Ukraine has initiative and forces Russia to make difficult decisions. Where to allocate resources, where to allocate troops. We know, for instance, that Russia has prioritized fiber optical drones to defend Kursk, right? So most of the fiber optic drones ended up in Kursk fighting the Ukrainian incursion. So that had, of course, a big impact on the overall war effort for Russia. Russia had to move this critical asset away from the front lines within Ukraine up to Kursk. So Ukraine moved an important piece of weaponry for the Russians away from the war in Ukraine and forced the Russians to allocate them to within Russia instead, right? So you see how this is important. You need the initiative, and it's good for morale. Armies wants to move forward. I talked about this in my previous video. Armies wants to push forward. They want to advance. Armies don't want to stand still. They don't want to move back. They want to push forward. And this is where Ukraine can effectively push forward to apply pressure, to take the fight to the enemy. And that is good for morale. The entire army can feed off of this energy created by these incursions, by these raids, by these offensive actions. Very crucial in the short term, and in the long run, of course, maybe this will have a huge impact on the war if Ukraine has a little bit of luck. Well, I hope you found that interesting, me going balls deep into Armchair General territory. Hopefully maybe I provided some interesting pointers. I mean, it all comes down to, in the end, what assets does Ukraine possess? Well, we don't know. We don't know how many troops they have. We don't know how many tanks they have. We don't know how much artillery they have, how much ammunition, and stuff like that. We do know that in 2025, it does appear as if Ukraine might actually gain an artillery advantage, incredibly enough, over Russia. In 2024, Russia started out with a 10-1 advantage, roughly speaking, depending on where on the front line you were, in artillery, in the artillery duel. For every Ukrainian shell fired, Russia fired back 10. That has now shrunk to a 2-1 advantage for Russia. Massive. And I mean, we are seeing it in the daily updates that Russia is losing dozens of artillery pieces daily. And now Europe and the United States have ramped up artillery ammunition production. Europe will produce 2 million 155 millimeter shells in 2025, the main artillery shell. United States will produce 1 million. Russia will produce 1.3 152 millimeter shells, their main artillery round, in 2025. So the West is now outproducing Russia in terms of the main artillery shell used, and these artillery shells are obviously being shipped by and large to Ukraine to help Ukraine in the war. So Ukraine is taking out huge numbers of Russian artillery. Meanwhile, Ukraine receives more and more advanced artillery like the Caesar, like the Archer, and stuff like that, building their own Bodana self-propelled howitzers en masse every month, while receiving huge supplies of artillery ammunition for these pieces. 2025 is when Ukraine might actually gain an artillery advantage. I made videos about this before. So, I mean, it's interesting. We are seeing Ukraine moving the war into Russia, right? Grinding down the Russian army at Pokrovsk, while also steadily gaining the upper hand in the artillery duel. And that is no small thing, because in this war, like every war for the past 150 years, artillery is king. 75 to 80% of all casualties happen due to artillery strikes, indirect fire. The same thing in this war. So having the artillery advantage is massive, and Russia is about to lose that advantage. Right? Russia is losing their main advantage, artillery. Russia is being forced to fight the war in Russia instead of Ukraine. And Russia might actually break if they try and push into Pokrovsk too soon. Right? This is interesting. Well, that's it. I hope I'll see you in the next one and that you found this interesting. And as always, go på marsch Ukraine and give them hell.